She tugged his sleeve and whispered, "The painting blinks at night." He thought she was imagining things until he took it off the wall and found the one thing he was never meant to see. Adrian Vale sat behind his broad oak desk, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, the glow from the monitor reflecting against his sharp features. The office was silent except for the faint hum of machines and the occasional scratch of his pen against paper. Outside, the city stretched far into the horizon, the lights of buildings flickering against the darkening sky. He barely noticed any of it, caught up in numbers, emails, and deadlines, convinced that focus was the only thing keeping his empire steady. In the doorway, a small figure lingered, almost blending into the shadows. Clara, 9 years old and quiet as a whisper herself, stood with her hands gripping the doorframe. She had learned how to stand still and wait without being noticed, a habit formed long before Adrian had taken her into his home. Her brown eyes moved across the room, watching everything the way only a child who had learned to survive by watching could. She stared at the painting above the fireplace, a bold abstract piece in shades of gold and red, then back at Adrian. Her lips parted, and though her voice was soft, it carried across the room. "It's inside that painting." Adrian blinked, his fingers pausing mid-gesture over the keyboard. He turned slightly, his expression puzzled, not angry, just distracted. He looked at her like a man interrupted at an important moment, his mind still wrapped in business while hers reached for something entirely different. "What's inside the painting?" he asked, his voice low, a touch of humor in it, as if she had spoken about monsters or ghosts. Clara shifted her weight, her small shoes scraping against the polished floor. Her eyes didn't leave the painting, and when she spoke again, her tone held no hint of playfulness. "Something. I've seen it blink." Adrian gave a short laugh, running a hand through his dark hair. "Clara, it's just paint on canvas. There's nothing in there to blink." But her tone, steady and certain, lingered in the air long after the words had passed. He tried to turn back to his screen, but the sound of her voice stayed with him, unsettling in its quiet conviction. He looked at her again, really looked this time, noticing the way her shoulders were squared, though her hands trembled slightly against the doorframe, the way her eyes were fixed on the painting, as though she were bracing herself against disbelief. Adrian wanted to dismiss it, to tell her she was imagining things, but there was something in her voice that did not feel like imagination. It carried the weight of a truth she had seen, but did not fully understand. He told himself she was just a child, but he also knew children sometimes notice details adults overlooked. He found himself glancing at the painting again, his chest tightening with something he could not name. "Go on to bed," he said finally, his voice softer now. But Clara did not move, and the way she stayed, her eyes never leaving the painting, made the room feel suddenly colder. The painting hung above the fireplace like a crown, large and bold. Splashes of crimson and gold stretched across the canvas in ways that caught the eye and demanded attention. It was the sort of piece people pretended to understand, the kind of art that spoke of money and status more than meaning. Camilla had chosen it herself, arriving at Adrian's home with it one evening as if she were presenting him with treasure. She had told him the piece reminded her of fire, of passion, of the kind of energy a man like him carried in his work. Adrian, who had never cared much for abstract art, had smiled and let her hang it anyway, because saying no to Camilla never came easily. She had that way of turning every suggestion into a test of loyalty, and he had grown used to nodding, used to giving her what she wanted. Now, with Clara's whisper still lingering in the back of his mind, the painting seemed heavier than before. Adrian leaned back in his chair, glancing at it with faint amusement, telling himself it was ridiculous to feel unsettled by a child's words. "It's inside that painting." What could possibly be inside a painting except canvas and wood and the faint scent of oils? He laughed softly to himself, but the laugh sounded hollow in the empty room. Clara remained in the doorway, her small frame tense, Her wide eyes locked on the top right corner of the frame, as though she could see something pulsing there. Adrian followed her gaze, half expecting to see the mysterious flicker she spoke of, but all he saw were shadows cast by the soft glow of the fire. Still, her silence weighed on him, her stillness pressing against his nerves in ways he did not want to admit. He reminded himself she was a child, prone to fancies, but there was something about Clara that made it difficult to dismiss her so easily. She was not like other children. She did not chatter. She did not beg for attention. She did not invent games to fill the silence. Clara watched. She noticed things, stored them away in her quiet mind, and spoke only when she was certain. In the 6 months since she had come into his house, he had learned this much about her, though he had not tried to learn more. He had given her comfort, yes, and safety, but he had not given her the warmth she sometimes searched for in his expression. He rose from his chair and walked toward the fireplace, shaking his head as though he were humoring her. He studied the painting, the way it filled the wall, the heavy golden frame Camilla had insisted on, the flawless way it had been mounted. His fingers brushed against the edge, cool and solid beneath his hand. "See, Clara?" he said lightly. "Just a painting." But Clara did not relax, did not move, her eyes steady and unblinking. And though Adrian smiled, inside he felt the first stirrings of doubt, as if maybe, just maybe, she had seen something he could not yet explain. Adrian let his hand rest against the cool frame of the painting, his eyes tracing the brushstrokes that meant nothing to him. But Clara's silence pressed harder than the art ever could. He turned back toward her, expecting to see her shift or look away the way children usually did when confronted. But she only stood there, steady and sure, her gaze fixed on the canvas, as though daring him to keep dismissing her. Something in her expression, so calm and so certain, made the room feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. "How do you know there's something inside?" he asked at last, his tone light, but beneath it a flicker of unease. Clara stepped into the room, her small shoes making the faintest sound against the polished floor. She didn't look at him, only at the painting. "Because I've been watching," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight far older than her 9 years. "At night, when the house is dark, it blinks. A tiny red light, in the corner of the frame. It's easy to miss unless you know where to look." Adrian frowned, instinctively glancing back at the gilded edges. He saw nothing now, only shadows and light. Still, the certainty in her words stirred something in him. He opened his mouth to laugh, to tell her she had imagined it, but stopped when he caught the sharpness in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a child spinning stories. It was the look of someone who had learned to be sure before they spoke. "Why were you watching the painting?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Clara finally turned her eyes toward him. "Because nobody else does. Adults don't notice the little things. They don't hear the clicks in the walls, or the buzzing that shouldn't be there. They don't see the way a light flashes when it's supposed to be still." She paused, her hands gripping the straps of her worn backpack, as though holding herself steady. "But I do. I always have." Her words unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. There was no pride in her voice, no hint of boasting. It was simply the truth, spoken the way a person might tell you the sky was blue or the ground was solid. Adrian studied her for a long moment, remembering the file he had skimmed when she first came into his care. Foster homes, temporary placements, notes from social workers about a quiet, watchful child. He had read it, then set it aside, thinking money and comfort would be enough. Now he realized those years had shaped her into something rare. A child who saw what others ignored. A child who had survived not by being loud, but by being precise. Adrian looked at the painting once more, his chest tightening as her words echoed. A blinking light. At night. Easy to miss unless you knew where to look. He forced a smile, but it faltered quickly. For the first time, he wondered if Clara had seen more than he ever had in his own home. Adrian returned to his desk, lowering himself into the leather chair with a heaviness he could not quite explain. His eyes drifted back to the painting, the bold streaks of crimson and gold glowing in the dim light of the fire. He wanted to dismiss Clara's words, to laugh them away as nothing more than a child's imagination, yet the certainty in her tone would not leave him. She had spoken with such quiet conviction, not as if she were guessing, but as if she knew. He rubbed at his jaw, feeling the tension gather there, his thoughts turning unwillingly to Camilla. Camilla had chosen that painting. She had brought it into his home with that smile of hers, the one that always seemed to sweep away his doubts before he could voice them. For 2 years she had stood by his side, graceful, confident, admired by everyone they knew. She knew how to move through his world with perfect ease, how to charm investors, and soften his sharp edges when he grew too focused on work. She made him believe that he was not just a businessman, but a man worth admiring outside the office walls. To suspect her, even for a second, felt like betrayal in itself. And yet, Clara had no reason to lie. The girl was not one for games or attention, not like the children of his colleagues who shrieked and demanded notice at every turn. Clara was different. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. Adrian had seen that same look in her eyes tonight that he had glimpsed once before, when she had pointed out a flaw in the security gate at the back of the property. He had ignored her then too, only to discover days later that she had been right. The sensor had been failing. He had brushed it off as luck, but perhaps it was not luck at all. Perhaps she really did notice the things others did not. He leaned forward, pressing his elbows to the desk, his mind restless. Could Camilla have placed something in the painting? The thought sounded absurd, like a story whispered over drinks at some late-night party. But what if Clara was right? What if there was something hidden in plain sight? He felt a surge of guilt, even entertaining the suspicion, but the unease did not fade. He thought of Camilla's perfect timing, the way she always seemed to know when to appear, how she could predict his late nights and his meetings as if she had been in the room herself. He remembered how insistent she had been about hanging the painting in his office, brushing off his suggestion to place it in the hallway. She had wanted it there, in the very room where he worked, where he spoke, where he kept things that mattered. Adrian sat back, the fire casting shifting shadows across his face. He wanted to believe in her. He wanted to hold on to the woman who made his life feel less empty, but Clara's eyes haunted him. She had no reason to invent such a claim, and he could not shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, she had saved him from looking the wrong way again. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settles only after midnight, when even the city outside seems to pause. Adrian sat in his office, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the shelves and floor. His eyes kept returning to the painting above the fireplace, its crimson and gold streaks catching the light in a way that seemed almost mocking now. Clara's words had lived in his mind all week, echoing in every moment of stillness. He told himself he was being foolish, letting a child's whisper unsettle him, but the doubt had rooted itself deep and refused to leave. Camilla was away for the evening, attending a charity dinner she had begged him to join. He had declined, claiming work, and for the first time, he felt grateful for his excuse. Alone in the house, he had no one to answer to, no elegant voice to laugh off his unease. He rose slowly from his chair, his pulse quickening though he could not say why, and crossed the room. The fire had burned low, its faint glow flickering against the gold frame, making it look like the painting itself was alive. He reached up and ran his hand along the edge, feeling the cold smoothness beneath his fingertips. It was just canvas and wood, he told himself, nothing more. Yet he could not ignore the tightening in his chest. With a careful pull, he lifted the frame from its hooks. It was heavier than he expected, the weight nearly slipping from his hands. He lowered it against the desk and leaned it forward, his breath coming faster as he turned it around. At first he saw nothing but the wooden backing and nails. Relief threatened to rise in his chest, ready to mock his own paranoia, until a faint blink caught his eye. A tiny red dot, buried in the corner of the frame, pulsing like the steady beat of a heart. Adrian froze, his entire body rigid, his eyes fixed on the light. Clara had been right. He leaned closer, and there it was, a sleek device no bigger than a matchbox, embedded neatly into the frame. Black, metallic, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It was not something a child could imagine. It was real, and it was here, watching, recording. Adrian's throat tightened as he realized the implications. Every conversation in this room, every private call, every moment he thought belonged only to him, could have been captured by this quiet, blinking machine. He sat heavily in his chair, the painting leaning against the desk like a discarded mask, the device glowing in the shadows. Camilla's voice filled his memory, soft and persuasive, insisting the painting belonged in his office, insisting it brightened the space, insisting it was perfect. He pressed his hand against his mouth, torn between rage and disbelief. Clara had seen what he had missed. She had not invented a story, she had uncovered a truth. And now, staring at the silent machine in the frame, Adrian felt the air in his office shift. Trust had cracked, and nothing would be the same again. Adrian turned the frame in his hands, his eyes locked on the tiny black device lodged against the wood. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just another piece of circuitry. But years of building firewalls and designing protective systems had taught him to recognize danger when he saw it. The edges were too smooth, the casing too refined, the faint glow of the light too deliberate. This was no hidden novelty, no toy. It was a transmitter, one crafted to blend into its surroundings, small enough to avoid suspicion, yet powerful enough to collect and send data without being caught. His chest tightened as he leaned closer, careful not to touch it. He knew the type, a design favored in corporate espionage, capable of capturing sound and encrypting it before passing it along to whoever waited on the other side. It was advanced enough to bypass most consumer detection systems, subtle enough to escape the eye of anyone who wasn't trained to notice. But Clara, a 9-year-old child, had seen it first, had spoken up when he himself had failed. That thought burned in him, cutting through his pride. He sat back in his chair, the painting resting against the desk, the red light blinking steadily like a quiet heartbeat. A list of every conversation he had held in this office, unspooled in his mind. Late-night strategy calls, private discussions with board members, sensitive updates about the new algorithm he had been developing in secret. His company's future, the very foundation of what he had built, could already be in someone else's hands. His jaw clenched as he realized how far this betrayal might reach. The air in the room seemed thinner, each breath harder to take. He thought of Camilla, her elegant smile, her soft hands placing this very painting against his wall. He had not questioned her gift, had not wondered why she was so insistent it stay here and not in the hall. He had accepted it as part of her charm, the way she always wanted beauty close to him. Now he saw it differently. Beauty as camouflage, affection as cover. The edges of his world began to blur. Adrian Vale, who had spent his career protecting others from threats, had let one into his home. He pressed his hands to his desk, the weight of it almost crushing. Every word he had spoken in confidence, every secret he had guarded with care, had likely been carried out of this room without his knowledge. He stood and began to pace, his mind racing with questions he did not want to answer. Who had planted it? Was it Camilla? Or had someone else used her as cover? Was it Marcus, his CFO, who had access to more than most? Or had the threat come from somewhere higher, one of the competitors who would do anything to take him down? The device blinked again, patient, relentless, reminding him that he was no longer safe in his own home. The unthinkable had become real. Someone had been listening, and they knew far too much. Adrian stood in front of the fireplace, the painting leaning against the desk, its hollow frame exposed for what it really was. The blinking device inside it felt like an accusation, each flicker of red pulling him deeper into a storm of questions he did not want to ask. He closed his eyes and let the memories come, one after another, pieces of a puzzle he had never thought to assemble. Camilla's voice was the first thing he heard. The lilting way she had said his office felt too bare, too serious, that a man like him needed warmth and beauty around him. He remembered the moment she brought the painting, dressed in a silk dress that shimmered like the canvas itself, her smile glowing with pride, as though she had given him a piece of herself. He had let her hang it, brushing aside the faint discomfort he felt, because it seemed easier to accept her charm than to question her motives. Now that memory soured, each detail poisoned with doubt. Other moments came rushing back, sharp and relentless. The way she would appear at his office door just as he ended a private call, carrying a glass of wine or a plate of fruit, laughing about how she always seemed to know when he needed her. The way she asked about his projects, not in broad strokes like someone casually curious, but in precise detail. What contracts were closing this quarter, which partners seemed unreliable, which new designs were nearly finished. He had thought her questions showed interest, proof that she cared about his world. Now he wondered if they had been something else entirely. Her timing, too, haunted him, the way she seemed to anticipate his schedule, arriving with comforting words at the exact moments he was most exhausted, or calling just before meetings with investors, telling him how proud she was. It had felt like love then, like partnership. But sitting in his chair now, staring at the device that had been listening in silence for months, he realized timing could be a strategy. Perfect timing often meant preparation, and preparation meant knowledge she should not have had. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Doubt bled into every smile she had ever given him, every kiss, every promise whispered in the quiet of night. Had it all been real, or had it been another mask she wore, another tactic to keep him from seeing the truth? He wanted to believe in her, wanted to believe that Camilla was incapable of this, but the evidence glared at him. The transmitter was not a suggestion, it was not suspicion, it was proof. Adrian felt something in his chest splinter, the fracture spreading through all the trust he had built with her. He had been careful in business his whole life, wary of deals that seemed too good, cautious of partnerships that came too easy. Yet in his personal life, he had let himself believe, let himself be blinded by beauty and comfort. The weight of betrayal pressed against him, heavy and merciless. The painting, once a symbol of elegance, now stood as a monument to lies. Adrian sat at his desk, the painting resting against the wall like a fallen mask, its secret exposed. The device inside still blinked, small and steady, reminding him of the danger that had slipped into his home without his knowledge. He leaned forward, his hands pressed together as he tried to make sense of it. He had built his career on guarding against threats like this, yet here in his own sanctuary, he had been blind. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him glance up, and there stood Clara, hovering in the doorway, her small frame outlined by the soft light spilling from the corridor. He motioned for her to come closer, his voice quiet but serious. "Clara, how did you know?" She stepped into the room, her brown eyes shifting between him and the broken illusion of the painting. She did not rush her words. She never did. "Because I've been checking," she said, her voice calm, though her fingers gripped the strap of her backpack as if for courage. "When the house gets quiet at night, I scan the Wi-Fi. I can see things moving through it, things that don't belong." Adrian frowned, confusion mixing with disbelief. "You scan the network? How?" Clara lifted the tablet she always carried, the one he had given her months ago when she first moved in. She held it like an extension of herself, swiping with quick, precise gestures. "I read the manuals you left in the library, the ones about network security and system architecture. You threw them out when you bought new editions, but I kept them. I wanted to understand how things work, so I started trying." He leaned closer, watching as the screen filled with numbers, graphs, and clusters of signals. It looked like something one of his engineers would produce, not a child. Clara pointed to a cluster of red dots glowing against the map of the house. "These are devices connected here. Some of them are yours, like your laptop and the cameras you installed." But others. She zoomed in, her finger steady. Others are different. They appeared only after she brought the painting. Adrian's stomach twisted. She? Clara's eyes flickered toward the hall, her meaning clear. Camilla. The first one showed up the night she gave you the painting. Then more appeared in the days after, in places she touched or moved things. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, so I kept watching. Adrian sank back in his chair, overwhelmed. This child, barely 9 years old, had uncovered what he had missed, not by accident, but through deliberate patience. He thought of her sleepless nights, bent over the tablet in the dark, teaching herself to read signals and patterns. She had done it silently, without asking for help, because silence was the skill that had kept her safe in the years before she came here. Clara closed the tablet, hugging it to her chest. I notice things, Adrian. I always have. When you've lived in houses where people smile but don't mean it, you learn to see what's real and what's not. Adults don't notice, but I do. For the first time, Adrian felt the depth of her presence in his life, the quiet strength she carried. She had seen what he could not, and she had saved him from a truth he had not wanted to face. Adrian stared at the tablet in Clara's hands, the small screen glowing between them like a lantern in the dark. Her map of the house showed far more than he ever imagined. Clusters of signals weaving through the rooms, each one carrying data he never gave permission to share. His throat tightened as he pointed at the glowing red dots. Show me where. Clara nodded and moved toward the hallway, her steps small but steady. Adrian followed, every muscle in his body taut. They entered the living room first, a space Camilla had filled with expensive touches she said made the house more welcoming. Clara walked straight to the marble vase on the coffee table, the one Camilla had brought back from a gallery in Paris. She tapped it with her knuckles and then looked up at him. Here, she said simply. Adrian leaned closer, his eyes narrowing until he saw it, a tiny seam along the base that should not have been there. His pulse quickened as he realized how carefully it had been planted, how easily it blended into the artful chaos of Camilla's taste. Next, they moved to the corner of the room where a tall floor lamp stood, casting its soft golden light across the rug. Clara crouched low and pointed to the underside of the base. Adrian bent to see for himself, and there it was, another blinking dot, this one faint but steady. He reached out, almost touching it, then pulled back, his hand shaking. Every word he had spoken in this room, every private conversation, every laugh or sigh in Camilla's company, all of it had been recorded. They walked together through the halls, Clara leading with her tablet, Adrian following in a silence heavier than stone. In the dining room they found another device inside the base of the chandelier. In his study, one was hidden within the hollow of a carved bookend. In the master bedroom, Clara stopped at his nightstand, her eyes flickering up to meet his as if asking for permission before she opened the drawer. Inside, nestled beneath neatly folded papers, lay yet another transmitter, blinking with quiet confidence. Adrian froze at the sight, bile rising in his throat. His most private space, the room he shared with Camilla, had been violated just like the rest. The deeper they searched, the more the map of his house transformed before his eyes. It was no longer a home, but a network. Every device linked to something outside these walls, feeding information into hands he could not yet see. Clara showed him how the signals traced back to external servers, their locations masked by layers of encryption. It was the kind of system he had only seen used by professionals, the kind of operation built not for curiosity but for destruction. Adrian pressed his hand against the wall, the weight of betrayal pressing back against him. His empire was crumbling not from a hostile takeover in a boardroom but from inside his own house, planted by the woman he thought he loved and overlooked by his own blind trust. The blinking lights were no longer just devices. They were proof that everything he believed about his life had been built on lies. Adrian stood in the center of his office, the fire low in the grate, shadows stretching across the walls like silent witnesses. Clara's tablet still glowed faintly on the desk, the map of signals displayed with ruthless clarity, each red dot a wound in the house he thought was safe. He pressed his hands to his temples, his mind racing through every possibility, every name, every face that could have been behind this. Yet no matter how he tried to reason it away, his thoughts kept circling back to one person, Camilla. He remembered the night she had first walked into his life, her laughter carrying across a crowded gala, her gown shimmering under the lights. She had looked at him as though she saw past the layers of wealth and success, as though she had found the man beneath the title. For 2 years she had been at his side, flawless and confident, filling the empty spaces of his life with warmth he had not known he craved. He had let her into his home, his bed, his world, believing that trust was the foundation of their love. And now, staring at the device that blinked from behind the frame of her gift, he felt that trust cracking into pieces, too sharp to hold. His chest tightened as memory after memory replayed in cruel detail. Her insistence that the painting belong in his office, her gentle laugh when he suggested moving it to the hall, her hand resting against his cheek as she told him that beauty should surround brilliance, her perfectly timed questions about his projects, always framed as curiosity, always delivered with a softness that made him open his mouth and share, her habit of lingering just outside the door when he was on late calls, slipping inside with wine at the exact moment his voice dropped in exhaustion. At the time, it had felt like care. Now, it felt like surveillance. Adrian's breath caught as he sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He could face rivals in boardrooms, he could fight competitors in the market, he could outthink enemies he could see. But this was betrayal with a face he had kissed. Betrayal with a voice that had whispered promises in the dark. Betrayal from the person he had thought of as his future. He wanted to tell himself there was another explanation, that Camilla was innocent, that she had no part in this web of deception. But the evidence was everywhere, blinking at him from the corners of his home. He thought of how she always seemed to know too much, how she anticipated his schedule with uncanny precision, how she had once joked that she knew him better than he knew himself. He had smiled then. Now the words twisted in his memory like a knife. Adrian pressed his hand against his chest, trying to steady the weight pressing down on him. Betrayal was one thing when it came from a rival. But betrayal from the woman he let closest, the woman he nearly asked to marry, was a wound he could not yet name, and it cut deeper than he ever thought possible. Adrian sat in his chair long after the fire had burned low, the glow of Clara's tablet casting shadows across the room. His thoughts were tangled, caught between disbelief and the bitter evidence blinking back at him from every corner of his home. He did not hear Clara approach until she was standing beside his desk, her small hands clutching the tablet tight against her chest. Her eyes carried that same steady weight she always seemed to hold, the kind of weight children should never have to bear. "There's something else," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence like a pebble dropped into still water. Adrian lifted his gaze, tired and wary, bracing himself for whatever she might say next. "What is it, Clara?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the tablet. "I've seen her, Camilla. When you're gone." His breath caught, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "Seen her doing what?" Clara glanced toward the door, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Then her eyes met his, clear and unwavering. "She meets with someone. Not just once, more than once. She acts surprised when I walk in, but she doesn't hide it very well. She says she's looking for something, or waiting for you, but I know better." Adrian leaned forward, his chest tightening. "Who?" The single word felt heavy in the air. Clara swallowed, her small face pale in the lamplight. "Marcus. Marcus Harlow." The name hit Adrian like a blow. For a moment he could not breathe, the sound of it echoing in his ears. Marcus, his CFO, his partner since the early days, the man who had stood beside him when the company was nothing more than an idea sketched on napkins. They had celebrated victories together, endured failures side by side, built trust through years of late nights and shared ambition. Marcus was not just an employee, he was family. And Clara was telling him that Camilla, the woman he almost married, had been meeting with him in secret. Adrian's first instinct was denial. His hands curled into fists on the desk as he tried to fight the surge of anger rising in him. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Clara nodded slowly. "I saw them in your office. They were whispering. She had papers from your desk." He showed her something on his phone. "And one time, I heard him say something about making sure the timing matched the launch." Adrian's vision blurred for a moment, his pulse pounding in his ears. The betrayal was no longer just suspicion, no longer just a hidden device in a painting. It was flesh and blood, faces he knew, voices he trusted, Camilla and Marcus. Together, he pressed a hand to his chest, struggling to steady his breath. Betrayal from Camilla had been enough to wound him, but betrayal from Marcus struck deeper, cutting into the foundation of everything he had built. The two people he had trusted most, in different ways, now joined against him. The thought left him cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bone. Clara stood quietly, waiting for him to speak, but Adrian had no words, only the hollow sound of trust shattering, echoing louder than anything else in the room. Adrian paced the length of his office, his hand dragging across the back of the leather chair, the fire throwing restless shadows across the room. Clara sat quietly on the sofa, her tablet balanced on her knees, her watchful eyes following his every movement. He could feel her gaze, but his thoughts were too loud, too jagged to let him rest. The names spun in his head like blades: Camilla and Marcus. Two people who had meant loyalty and love. Two people he had trusted without hesitation. The more he thought about it, the clearer the pieces became. Camilla with her perfect timing, her gentle questions about his work, her insistence on being near his office during calls she had no reason to care about. Marcus with his access to the company's deepest files, his knowledge of every deal, every prototype, every move Adrian made. Separate, each suspicion might have been explained away. Together, they formed a picture too sharp to ignore. He stopped at the desk, leaning his palms against the cool surface, his head bowed as the realization pressed down on him. The painting had been the entry point, the first seed planted by Camilla, but the network Clara had uncovered stretched far wider than that. The vase, the lamp, the bookend, the nightstand. Each device not only listened but transmitted, carrying data beyond these walls, feeding it to an enemy he had not yet named. He forced himself to think like he did in boardrooms, stripping emotion from fact. What did Marcus and Camilla gain from this? The answer surfaced with brutal clarity. His algorithm, the one project that had consumed him for months, the breakthrough his company had been counting on to secure its future. It was more than software. It was a new level of protection, a system so advanced it could change the entire industry. Competitors had circled like vultures since the moment rumors spread. And now he saw how perfectly the trap had been set. Camilla drew him in with beauty and trust, placed herself in his life, until he no longer questioned her presence. Marcus stood beside him in the company, privy to everything, disguising betrayal as friendship. Together, they could bleed him dry, feed his work piece by piece to the competition, make him look careless, ruin his reputation, and seize his crown while the world believed he had stumbled. Adrian straightened slowly, his breath sharp in his chest. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, hidden in plain sight, almost invisible because it wore the mask of closeness. He thought back to every moment Camilla had pressed a kiss to his cheek, every time Marcus had clapped him on the shoulder, every toast they had shared to success. All of it, he realized now, had been cover for something much colder. Clara looked at him, her voice steady though her small hands clenched the tablet. "They're trying to take everything, aren't they?" He met her gaze, and though his heart ached with the weight of betrayal, his answer was certain. "Yes. And they think they've already won. The night pressed heavily against the windows, the kind of silence that carries more weight than calm. Adrian sat at his desk, staring at the scattered evidence of betrayal. The blinking red dots, still glowing in Clara's network map like warnings, written in fire. His thoughts turned over and over, circling around Camilla and Marcus, around the company he had built, around the future that seemed to be slipping from his hands. He was used to acting, used to making decisions without hesitation. Yet now, he found himself frozen, unsure if he was strong enough to face the truth that had taken root inside his own home. Clara stood across from him, her tablet held firmly in both hands, her eyes steady in a way no child's should be. She had been waiting for him to speak, but when he didn't, she broke the silence herself. "We can't wait," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "If we wait, they'll erase everything. They'll take it all, and you'll never be able to prove what they've done." Adrian lifted his gaze to hers, the weight of her words pressing against him. "Clara, this isn't your fight. You've already done more than I could have imagined. You saw what I didn't, and I owe you everything for that. But this is dangerous. These people won't stop if they think someone knows." She shook her head, her tangled hair falling against her cheeks. "It doesn't matter if it's dangerous. I've been watching them. I know how the devices work, and I can intercept the signals. If I trace them back, before they cover their tracks, you'll have proof. Without it, they'll make you look like the guilty one." Her certainty struck him harder than her words. She stood in front of him, a child carrying the weight of betrayal that belonged to adults. Yet she spoke with the clarity of someone who had already survived too much. Adrian's chest tightened as he studied her, torn between the instinct to protect her and the knowledge that she had already saved him once when no one else could. "Clara," he said softly, "you shouldn't have to do this. You should be worrying about school, about friends, about things that belong to children, not espionage and betrayal." Her brown eyes met his without flinching. "I've never had that," she answered simply. "In the homes I lived in before, the only way to stay safe was to notice things adults ignored. That's how I knew who to trust, when to stay quiet, when to hide. It's the only reason I'm here now. I saw something wrong, and I spoke." She held up the tablet, its glow casting light across her determined face. "I can do this, Adrian. I already have." The truth in her words cut through him. She was only 9, but she had been braver than most adults he had known. He hesitated still, wanting to tell her no, wanting to lock the door and shield her from the storm he knew was coming. But as he looked into her steady eyes, he realized she was not asking for permission. She was offering him the one thing he could not create on his own: time. Adrian's breath left him in a heavy sigh. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this together. You don't take one step without me." Clara's shoulders eased, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Then we'll stop them, before they think they've won." The rain tapped against the wide windows as Adrian stood in the library, the shelves of leather, bound books looming over him like silent judges. Clara sat at the long oak table, her tablet glowing in front of her, the maps of signals and transmissions shifting like constellations under her fingertips. Across from her, Josephine, the housekeeper who had been with Adrian's family since before he had built his company, sat with her hands folded neatly, her sharp eyes fixed on the child with a mixture of wonder and quiet concern. Adrian had called them both together because he could no longer face this storm alone, and he knew if he was going to stop Camilla and Marcus, he needed allies who would not betray him. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room. "I can't fight this from the outside. They've already planted devices in my home. They've been listening for months. If I confront them now, they'll destroy every trace of evidence before anyone can believe me. The only way to win is to let them think they've succeeded." Josephine's gaze softened, though her voice was steady. "You're talking about a sting, about watching them as they watch you." Adrian nodded, his eyes moving to Clara. "Exactly. And Clara's already proven she can track their transmissions. If we can record everything they're sending out, if we can capture their actions as they happen, we'll have proof no one can deny. Clara looked up from her tablet, her face illuminated by the pale light. They're careful, but they're not perfect. They trust the devices too much, which means I can follow the data back. I can create a mirror copy of what they're stealing. So every file they take, we'll have too. And every message they send, we'll know before it reaches them. Then, my grasped with a surge of lung. Josephine leaned back, the corners of her mouth pressing into a thin line. You're asking a child to do the work of professionals, Mr. Vale. And yet, she's already done it, hasn't she? Adrian's chest tightened. She has. She saw what I didn't. And I won't let her carry this alone. We do this together, the three of us. Camilla and Marcus believe I'm distracted, that I'll fall into the trap they've set. But instead, every step they take will lead them into ours. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow against the tension in the room. Clara's small fingers danced over the screen, pulling up streams of code that looked far too complex for her age. If we let them move forward, they'll try to extract the algorithm during the launch, she said quietly. That's their target. If we plant a decoy server filled with bait, they'll take it. And when they do, we'll know exactly where it goes. Adrian studied her, pride and fear warring inside him. Josephine reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on Clara's. You're braver than most grown men I've known, she murmured. Adrian straightened, his voice clear now, his resolve no longer wavering. Then it's decided. We let them play their game, but we'll be the ones writing the ending. The kitchen glowed with soft light, the scent of rosemary and garlic drifting through the air as Camilla moved gracefully between the counter and the stove. She wore an apron over her silk blouse, her hair tied back in a way that made her look almost ordinary, almost domestic, as if she belonged in this house in the simplest, most innocent way. Adrian sat at the table, his hands resting loosely around a glass of wine, watching her with eyes that gave nothing away. She laughed lightly as she stirred the pan, her voice warm, her gestures practiced, every movement flowing with the ease of someone who knew she was being admired. She placed a plate before him, leaning close enough that her perfume brushed against his skin, whispering about how hard he worked, how she wanted to take care of him. Adrian smiled at the right moments, nodded when he was supposed to, let his eyes meet hers as though he were still the man who had once believed in every word she spoke. But inside, every gesture she made cut him open. Each smile was a mask, each touch a dagger pressed against his ribs. He heard Clara's words in the back of his mind, saw the blinking red lights of the devices hidden in his home, felt the weight of Marcus's name like a stone in his chest. Clara sat quietly in the doorway, half hidden by the frame, her tablet clutched against her knees. She said nothing, but her eyes missed nothing either. She watched Camilla glide across the kitchen with a kind of calm that no child should have, her small body still, her gaze sharp. She did not flinch at the laughter, did not soften at the show of tenderness, because she had learned too early that people could play roles, that kindness could be a costume worn over cruelty. Adrian forced himself to lift his fork, to eat what Camilla had placed before him, the taste of herbs and butter turning bitter on his tongue. She leaned across the table, her hand brushing over his, her smile luminous as she spoke about how proud she was of him, about how she knew tomorrow's launch would change everything. He wanted to rip his hand away, to demand the truth, to call her out for every lie, but instead, he let his fingers stay still beneath hers. He could not reveal what he knew, not yet. He had to let her believe she was winning, that the act was working, because the sting they were building depended on it. Clara shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes flicking from Camilla to Adrian, and back again. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened each time Camilla touched him, but she also saw his control. He was pretending for survival, just as she had once pretended in the houses where she lived before. She understood that silence could be a weapon, and in that moment, she and Adrian were bound by the same quiet resolve. Camilla laughed again, pouring more wine, her performance flawless, her betrayal hidden in sweetness. But the house no longer belonged to her lies. Adrian's mask was stronger now, and Clara's steady watch reminded him that the truth, though buried, was waiting to rise. The night of the launch arrived with a kind of electricity that ran through every corner of Adrian's house. The city outside glittered with anticipation. Investors and clients filling the grand hall of the hotel, where his company's unveiling was set to take place. Inside his home, however, a quieter storm was brewing. Camilla moved through the rooms with her usual grace, her dress flowing like liquid silver, her lips painted into a smile that could disarm any doubt. Marcus had already left hours earlier, claiming he needed to prepare details at the office, though Adrian knew exactly what those details were. They thought tonight would be the night they destroyed him. The night they would take everything he had built and leave him with nothing but suspicion on his name. Adrian stood before the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie with steady hands that betrayed none of the fury inside him. Clara sat on the bed, her tablet balanced on her lap, eyes fixed on the streams of data scrolling across the screen. She had been watching since dusk, her small fingers darting across the glass, intercepting messages, tracking signals, noting every move Camilla and Marcus made. Josephine had joined them earlier, quiet and alert, ready to gather whatever evidence Clara captured. At 10 o'clock, Camilla slipped into his office while Adrian pretended to finish dressing. Clara's voice came softly from the tablet, her tone calm and precise. "She's accessing the server now. She doesn't know she's in the decoy system. Everything she's stealing is the bait." Adrian felt his jaw tighten, but he stayed where he was, allowing the trap to unfold. Marcus, meanwhile, was at the company headquarters. Clara traced his actions too, watching as he slipped forged documents into Adrian's files, careful signatures copied, deposits fabricated, a trail designed to frame Adrian as the man who had sold his own algorithm for profit. Adrian's chest tightened as he thought of the betrayal, of how Marcus had once toasted with him to their success, had once called him brother. By 11, the plan was in full motion. Camilla sat at Adrian's desk, her expression composed as she transmitted files through encrypted channels, believing she was moments away from victory. Marcus sent the final messages to their contacts overseas, confirming that the package would be ready by morning, and that Adrian Vale would be the name dragged through the mud when authorities found the trail. But what they did not know was that every move, every keystroke, every whisper was being recorded. Clara's mirrored system captured not only the stolen files, but also the evidence of the theft itself. Josephine, standing quietly behind the child, pressed a hand to her shoulder and whispered, "Keep going, darling. You're saving him." Adrian stepped out of his room at last, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. He paused in the doorway of his office, watching Camilla's flawless performance unravel into something colder. He said nothing yet, only letting the weight of the moment settle, because he knew that when the curtain fell tonight, it would not be on him. The sound of sirens came first, faint at the edges of the night, rising closer until they cut through the quiet of the house. Camilla looked up from Adrian's desk, her fingers frozen over the keyboard, her perfect smile flickering for just a second. She smoothed it back into place quickly, as though nothing had happened, but Adrian, standing in the doorway, saw the shift. It was the first crack in the mask she had worn so flawlessly for 2 years. Moments later, the front doors burst open, heavy boots echoing against marble floors, voices sharp and commanding as agents moved through the hall. Camilla's eyes widened, her hand tightening around the mouse, as if she could erase everything in an instant. But it was too late. Clara's mirrored system had already captured every file she had transmitted, every message Marcus had sent, proof wrapped around them like chains, undeniable and final. "Step away from the desk," one of the agents barked as they entered the office. Camilla rose slowly, her posture still elegant, her face shifting into confusion, then indignation. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice dripping with hurt. "Adrian, tell them this is a mistake." Adrian did not move. His chest felt heavy, not with panic but with the crushing truth that the person he had trusted, the woman he had almost asked to marry, was nothing more than an actress in a role designed to ruin him. His silence was her answer. Her eyes darted to him, searching for a lifeline, but found only steel. As Camilla was pulled aside, struggling against the hands that gripped her arms, her voice sharpened into desperation. "Adrian, you can't believe this. I love you. I did all of this for us." But the mask was gone now, the pleading in her tone ringing false, each word another lie too fragile to stand. Across town, Marcus's night ended the same way. Agents stormed into the office where he had been planting the last pieces of forged evidence. He tried to protest, tried to claim loyalty, but the files on his computer and the records of his encrypted calls spoke louder than his words. His betrayal, so carefully hidden, was laid bare in front of men who did not care for excuses. When the message came back that Marcus Harlow had been taken into custody, Adrian felt a strange mixture of grief and relief wash over him. Standing in the ruins of their deception, Adrian looked around his office, at the fire crackling low, at the painting leaning discarded against the wall, at Clara sitting quietly on the sofa, with her tablet still glowing. His empire had almost been stolen, not by rivals in boardrooms, but by the two people he had allowed closest to his heart. The realization cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. For the first time that night, Adrian walked to Clara and knelt beside her. His voice was low, but steady. "You saved me," he said, and in her small, knowing eyes, he saw the truth. The empire was still his, but only because a child who had learned to see what others ignored had refused to stay silent. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of lawyers, reporters, and endless questions. But through it all, Adrian found himself looking for Clara first each morning. The mansion no longer felt like the cold place it once had been, even though the scars of betrayal still lingered in its corners. Camilla was gone, Marcus too, their names now tied to charges and investigations, their faces absent from the life they had tried to poison. What remained was quieter, steadier, built not on performance or lies, but on something real. The adoption papers had taken time, though Adrian pushed every step forward with a determination that surprised even him. He had thought money and power were the things that showed control, but he learned instead that patience, persistence, and a simple signature on a piece of paper could carry more weight than any deal he had ever closed. When the day came, and the judge's gavel struck lightly to seal the agreement, Clara became his daughter in name as well as in spirit. She did not cry, but her hand slipped into his, and she held on tightly, as though for the first time she believed she would not be let go. Back at the mansion, the changes were subtle but meaningful. The painting that had once loomed above the fireplace, its colors as false as the promises tied to it, was gone. In its place, Adrian had chosen to hang Clara's drawings, framed in simple wood, the lines shaky but filled with honesty. A house that had once been dressed in disguises now wore the truth of a child's imagination, and Adrian found himself staring at those frames more often than he had ever looked at Camilla's gift. Each drawing was a reminder of what he had almost lost, and of the second chance he had been given. Josephine remained as steady as ever, her presence grounding them both. She fussed over meals and schedules, but more than that, she treated Clara with the kind of care that had been missing from the girl's early years. Adrian often caught them together in the kitchen, Clara chattering more freely now, her eyes brighter, Josephine listening with the patience of someone who knew the value of being heard. At night, the house no longer hummed with hidden signals. Adrian had torn out every device, replaced the network with systems of his own design, and given Clara her own set of tools, not as a child dabbling where she should not, but as a partner whose skill he now trusted. Together, they tested the new firewalls, laughed at the idea of anyone ever trying to slip past them again, and though the work was serious, Adrian found joy in it for the first time in years. The mansion was no longer a stage for deception. It was a home, filled with trust earned the hard way, built on a truth spoken by a child when he refused to listen. Adrian walked through its halls with Clara by his side, and understood finally that wealth and power meant little without someone to share them. Family was not given by chance, it was chosen, and in choosing each other, they had built something that could not be stolen. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.